If you think the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints agrees and supports your position on ICE and immigration, it might be time to read some of their statements a little bit more closely, because the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, it's a global church and there's a lot going on here. The reality is this has been a tough time for the United States. There have been ICE crackdowns, and Nick Shirley has been covering potential fraud cases in Minnesota, which has then intensified some of the immigration tension, which has all culminated in the deaths of now two Minnesota protesters at the hands of federal agents. And members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, they fall on both sides of this spectrum. We've got liberal members and conservative members, and we've got undocumented residents, and also we've got federal agents who are members of the church. So the question is, what side does the church take, and therefore what side should you take? And the answer is, well, neither. If you're looking for a church policy or doctrine that's going to validate your particular political ideology, I'm sure you can cherry pick to find something. But as an institution, the church does not align with a single political tribe. And I actually think that's a really good thing for a couple reasons. The truth is that the church does speak out about immigration. They've made several statements in the past, and there are a few issues that are important to the church from a moral and ethical standpoint, but it doesn't come hard on either side. And I think that's the point. Not only is that just a practical way to operate a global church, but I ultimately think that it is the best way for the members actually going through these hard times. And I get that this is a very sensitive topic. The reality is that this isn't just like policy on tax decisions or how much money to spend on one program or another. I mean, we're talking about where you live, your home, feeling safe in your country, families being pulled apart. It's very emotional, intense stuff. And it's somewhat personal even to me. I'm the daughter of a South American immigrant, and I'm very grateful for the very difficult journey my father had to go through in order to come to this country. And yet, even within my own family, there's a diversity of opinions on how this particular issue should play out politically. And I think that's great. And, but at the end of the day, as I'm trying to grapple with the current events in our nation right now, my loyalty is first and foremost to God and to the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so I'm very interested in understanding where the church's position is on this and why I think they came to that decision to take this position. And so we need to look back at their statements that they've made over the last few years. The most recent statement they made is in 2025, in January. We're going to switch over to, here we go. So in January of 2025, the church made this statement. And they say that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has reiterated principles and communicated guidelines to local leaders in the United States regarding immigration issues. And as disciples of Jesus Christ, the following principles guide the church's approach. So these are not strict policies. These are not platforms that they're campaigning. These are principles, which means that they are pretty resilient across time and across specific situations that we've encountered. Now, the first one, what I want to focus on here is that Latter-day Saints should obey the law. And that's fairly straightforward. It's often a talking point on the conservative side when it comes to this particular issue. Previous statements that the church has made has also included lines such as countries have a right to enforce their borders. Sometimes they say countries have an obligation to enforce their borders, and they'll cite the 12th Article of Faith, that we believe in honoring, obeying, and sustaining the law. And this makes sense. I mean, think about it from just an operational standpoint. As a global church, the church can't be operating in a place where they're constantly bending or disobeying laws, where they feel there's ever a question of moral tension there. So they have a broad policy that, like, we have to be law-abiding citizens in whatever country we're residing in, no matter what regime is in place, no matter what administration is in place or what policies are there that may be hard for members of the church. It's from a practical standpoint, we just have to do that as a policy. So it makes sense to me. And the virtue of that is that it allows the gospel of Jesus Christ to reach more people. And I'm pretty sure that's the goal. The idea is that, I mean, at least I believe that the most powerful remedy for almost all of the world's ills is living the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so if I believe that anyone going through a difficult time, anyone dealing with intense stress, anyone grappling with how they should conduct their lives, I think the gospel of Jesus Christ is the remedy. So I'm very interested in seeing that the church's message can spread to as many countries and as many places as possible. And that requires that the church is obeying and sustaining laws. So that makes a lot of sense to me. But that being said, there are some exceptions to when this has happened. So I've heard people bring up the fact that in the 19th century, Latter-day Saints did not always obey the law. So in the 19th century, specifically like the 1880s, this was when the church was undergoing intense persecution. They had been practicing plural marriage for a long time. And at this point, they had been pretty open about it for a little while, and the U.S. government was very unhappy with that. And so they enacted laws to specifically target Latter-day Saints. And I think that's the biggest thing here, is that this was a pre-existing practice that the church was already doing when a law changed. And so this wasn't something where the church was going out of their way to break a law. This was something where they were just trying to live their lives in peace, and the government targeted them. This was not just like a moral question or an ethical question. It was a religious one because it was targeted towards Latter-day Saints. In addition to that, the situation was a little bit different too because, I just lost my place there. On plural marriage, they were targeting our beliefs, but also this was a different time and place in like the development of the church's history. So think about how the fact that we were basically just in Utah and a couple other places. And so this was, the first big political challenge to the church, not the first one, but, this was a major political challenge to the church that the leaders of the church prayerfully thought through and said, okay, we've been commanded to practice plural marriage, and the government is now making that illegal to do. What is our response? How do we deal with this moral, ethical, religious question? And they felt impressed that the Lord wanted them to continue polygamy. And so they did. They just decided to take that on faith, to the point where many members of the church were arrested. Even Lorenzo Snow, who was an apostle at the time, was arrested and served jail time for practicing plural marriage. Other leaders of the church went into hiding. And so Latter-day Saints could look at that and say, well, sure, there's been other times where the church was willing to bend the law, skirt the law, disobey the law in order to do a greater good or to achieve what they feel like is the greater moral stance or religious stance. But again, this is a different time. The church was not a global church, and this was a religious practice specifically. This wasn't like a political issue. This wasn't a social issue. This was a religious issue. And so for the church it was just a different situation. And so I don't think the church would ever take that position now, because we are a global church, because they have so many different countries' laws to account for. And this particular issue we're talking about today, immigration, is more of a social, communal, civil issue and less a strictly religious one. And so, yeah, you had people, Latter-day Saints, serving time because they believed in plural marriage, and this was kind of a form of resistance to let the government know that they still were going to stick to their guns. Of course, eventually in 1890, Wilford Woodruff issued the Manifesto, which was the formal ceasing of plural marriage for the church as an institution. And that became, again, a decision that was very prayerful with the church leaders, saying the persecution is intense, and it's not just personal sacrifices. They are disenfranchising the church. They're seizing assets, which means they're going to take possession of the temple. And Lord, we need the saints to have the temple. And so Wilford Woodruff had a sense of what the future was going to hold, and the Lord's work could not roll forth unless they were able to operate legally. And so really from that time forth, for the most part, the church has tried to obey the law. But the other thing that I hear people potentially commenting is about church finances. Like, oh, Isn't the church financial situation a situation where the church broke the law? And in 2019, the SEC, or maybe I guess it was kind of 2020 really when that, like, the decision finally came through. But in 2020, the SEC did fine the church several $1 million for their financial situation. Now, critics of the church will see that and say, like, well, that was a case of the church deliberately defrauding the government. This is a dishonest practice. The church is trying to hide their money and not be honest in their dealings. I don't have that take in this particular situation. I feel like that's just, as I've looked through the evidence, I mean, this isn't a video about church finances, so I'm not going to get into the weeds here. But looking at the evidence, I don't think this is a case of intentionally frauding the government. Every company, institution, and individual on planet Earth hires accountants or tries to find ways to mitigate their tax burden. And I think this is just a common sense thing to do. Everyone wants lower taxes as much as legally is permissible. And that's exactly what the church did. They have hired accountants to see how can we mitigate the tax burden like any institution or organization or individual would do. And so I see this whole situation as a combination of making mistakes as well as the government having a very rigid interpretation of tax law, which is insanely complex. And so we may come to different conclusions, but I just don't think in this case, this is the church deliberately trying to break the law. On the whole, in general, the church supports obeying the law, and that is very important. Now, when it comes to this next point, I'm going to actually skip to number 3 and we're going to do number 2 last. So this last point is really interesting because this kind of indicates one instance where the church spoke out against actions of the government. So it says, we seek to provide basic food and clothing as our capacity allows to those in need, regardless of their immigration status. We are especially concerned about keeping families together. There's 2 things there that are really, really interesting in my opinion. The first is the fact about the food and clothing as our capacity allows. This is in response, I believe, to leaders of the church. So the question of, like, can we provide financial assistance? Can we pay for someone's rent or their mortgage or pay their bills if they're in financial need and they are struggling? And I believe the implication of this principle is that if they're an undocumented resident, it is not appropriate to be financially paying for those bills, because there is some boundary that we're trying to set in order to thread the needle of obeying the law and not encouraging or enabling breaking the law. However, we also have a Christian duty to be charitable, to take care of those who are in need. And so for that reason, the bishop's storehouse and providing food and clothing as much as possible is 100% within the purview of what we are called to do as Christians. And so we should. But the part about families, keeping families together, I think also can cut both ways on the political aisle. So the strength of the family is a top priority for the church. This is not just because the church likes the nuclear family. It's a nice social construct. We believe the theology of the Latter-day Saint Church is very tied to the family. We believe that the nuclear family is the fundamental core that builds the structure of heaven and that connects us all to each other, is those sealing ordinances that forges a man and a woman together, and then they're able to procreate, and then that they have generations of posterity after them. The family is so important, and for that reason, the church places high priority on the importance of the family. And so on the one hand, you've got separating children from parents at the border. I believe that's what this is referencing. In fact, the church made a statement in 2018 making as such explicit, says, due to media inquiries, the church has issued the following statements. This is 2018, several years ago. The church has long expressed its position that immigration reform should strengthen families and keep them together. The forced separation of children from their parents now occurring at the U.S.-Mexico border is harmful to families, especially to young children. And we are deeply troubled by the aggressive and insensitive treatment of these families. We recognize the right of all nations to enforce their laws and secure their borders. We encourage our national leaders to take swift action and to correct the situation and seek for rational, compassionate solutions. So that is pretty blatantly referring to a specific immigration event in which they have a strong stance about, we want to promote keeping families together. The separation of child from parent is something the church did not think was very appropriate. And I think that makes sense. We need to, that just as far as humane treatment, the dignity of humanity, keeping families together is important. But there's also another way to interpret this that I think can cut in the other direction politically. About 5 years ago, they made another statement. Okay, I think it's this one. Yes. Okay, so this was a statement they made even earlier, which is very similar. Again, the same three principles, but this time the family element was just worded a little differently. We recognize an ever-present need to strengthen families. Families are meant to be together. Forced separation of working parents from their children weakens families and damages society. So I think that is, again, in reference to separating children from parents at the border. However, at least when I first read that, I also interpreted it as potentially when you are in another country and one parent leaves the family in order to immigrate to that other country and then send money back home. Again, that's how I initially read it. And I do think the intention of that phrase was more about the border. But in both of those cases, you are separating the family, and that introduces unique stressors on a family unit. And so that's just something to consider, that when it comes to immigration, no matter what side you're on, keeping the family together in those units is a really important aspect. So, encouraging families to stay together when it's their choice, and encouraging governments to allow that to happen when it's not. So the final point, though, let's see, here we go. The final point in their statement, we're going to go back to number 2, I think is the one that both sides of the political aisle are struggling with the most right now. And we always do. I mean, we're just human. We follow Jesus Christ by loving our neighbors. The Savior taught that the meaning of neighbor includes all of God's children. And yes, this includes illegal immigrants. This includes federal agents. It includes people, your liberal neighbors. This includes your conservative neighbors. It was, the reality is that everyone is welcome to their own political beliefs. Everyone is welcome to advocate for change and for the policies that they think are important and that they believe strongly in. This is not to say that you shouldn't stand up for your political passions and that you shouldn't be involved civically. However, at no point should we be villainizing whole groups of people, and we have been called to love even when we disagree, especially when we disagree, to love our enemies, all of that. And personally, I feel like I've seen so much demonizing on both sides of just whole swaths of people, whole categories of people, categorizing every single government employee that's just trying to do their job, or categorizing every conservative as a degenerate, awful human being. That's probably an unfair characterization. And categorizing the entire group of illegal immigrants as murderers and rapists, that's also probably a very unfair characterization. We can critique policy and the actions of individuals without maligning entire populations without compassion. We are called to love our enemies, and I believe that often the most effective way to bring about change is to love our enemies, to build bridges instead of building walls. Communication often works better that way. And I think it's just important to recognize, how would your own online rhetoric change, and how would your own in-person interactions change if you had an illegal immigrant in your relief society, or an ICE agent who attended your elders quorum, or attended the temple with you. There are members of the church in both of these camps. And while, again, people should advocate for the change they want to see, people should get involved, and they should be welcome to express their opinions, I get very concerned about the villainizing of just all of these groups wholesale when there's just a lot of complexity. This is a really hard issue, and I think that we need to just give each other grace. We need to give the opposing ideology a little bit of grace, but most importantly, the individuals and the humans grace that are working through this. And most of them are just trying to do the best they can to survive or do their job, or to make it to the next day and to be with their families. And I recognize that there are just strong emotions at play here. That's not to mitigate that. Like I said, people should get involved. They should advocate for what they believe in kind, compassionate ways. But when we're just demonizing or mischaracterizing the other side, I think it actually does harm to our respective cause because, again, we're misrepresenting what's actually going on. We're not getting to the truth of what's really happening and how we can be a proactive, positive change for good. So things we can do to kind of combat that. I think we can avoid hyperbole. Avoid exaggeration in describing the other side. We can humanize their motivations, that it's not just because of greed or because of power or because whatever this is, and just being reductive about their motivations, but really understanding that there's a lot going on here. And we can prioritize our desire to build a better world. I think all of us want that in theory, but sometimes we let our desire to be right get in the way of that priority to build a better world. So we can just keep all of that in mind. And I think at the end of the day, the church isn't here to police politics in the United States. I mean, we are a global church after all. And sometimes I think when we are looking for the church to make a statement about this or make a policy about that, we're looking to be handheld on a lot of these issues. It can be a pretty American-centric way to view, because the church is so vast and there are so many needs and there's so many tragedies happening every single day that it behooves us to make sure we're considering the whole when we ourselves are struggling with a stressor or anxiety that we're dealing with in our own communities. And the church recognizes that there are compelling reasons to advocate for certain policies, to advocate for what you believe in. Even the top leadership of the church, they're not all of the same political party, and they have a lot of differences of opinions. And that's something that they celebrate, because it's something that it means that they're not monolithic, that they can have good animated discussions about disagreements, but they're all compassionate. But the church is about preaching the gospel. It's about teaching moral principles and allowing members to have their agency. And I think this is the only and best position the church really can take. Like I said, with a global church, it is impractical to fixate on policy decisions of a specific country. And also the church just doesn't want to create divisions within its own membership when we have members on both sides of the aisles, in both camps, who are liberal, conservative, immigrants, government employees. But most of all, I think the most important reason why the church doesn't take a side when it comes to immigration, but they just provide principles. They provide guidance that are eternal, that are in line with just eternal doctrine and aren't necessarily partisan in nature. The reason they don't do that is because ultimately I think that is what can bring the most peace to those people who are actually struggling and having a hard time. It can be traumatizing and heartbreaking to witness violence in our streets. I don't think the human brain was meant for the social media violence that we're just seeing all over the place. It can be stressful to immigrate to a new country and to be surrounded by a new culture, and then to maybe feel unsafe in that new country and culture and with your family. It can be distressing to stand up for what you believe in and be shouted down on both sides. It can be stressful to feel like your country's government is being undermined by civil unrest. Like, all of these things can be valid and true, and you can be feeling pain from different points. But it is not the role of the church to validate your political ideology. However, it is Jesus Christ's role to empathize with that pain. At the end of the day, Jesus Christ is the source of all healing, all peace. When no matter what regime is in charge, no matter what administration is in charge of your government in whatever part of the world you live, you can advocate for change. You can do good things to be a positive influence in your community. But the things that happen to you in your life, the tragedies that occur, I think the only way you can have a fulfilled sense of peace and coming to terms with that grief is through the hope that Jesus Christ offers. And I think that's the point. The church doesn't want to make this about a policy. They don't want to make this about a statement or the specific wording of a specific phrase to, get all the church members in line in a specific way. No, it's about, they provide principles because ultimately they want you to not focus on the policy or the specific issue at hand. They're trying to point people to Jesus Christ. That is the role of the church, is draw people onto Jesus Christ. And so everything they do, every newsroom statement they make, every policy they make is all about how can we turn people towards the principles and the doctrine that will actually heal their souls and provide hope in the hereafter, instead of having them fixate on things that so often are out of their control. And so at the end of the day, we find peace in Christ. not in politics, and that's the point. This isn't a political channel, so clearly I'm not here to take a side on this particular issue. But I've seen concerning rhetoric and behavior on both sides of this issue and in response to the recent events. And so while that's been concerning to me, I do hope that as Latter-day Saints, we can rise above the heated emotions of this intense moment we're in and refocus on our covenants to love God and love our neighbor, no matter where they come from or what country they're in or what side of the political aisle they're on. So I appreciate all you guys in the comments who have been very animated in providing some of your insights here. And again, like, I welcome the disagreement as long as it's charitable, as long as it's kind, because it's complex. There are compelling reasons to feel passionately about your political stance, but I get very worried when we prioritize our political ideology and our political tribe, really, over the tribe we are supposed to belong to, being covenant sons and daughters of God. There's a reason President Nelson has emphasized over and over and over that the most important identity you can have is to be a child of God, child of the covenant, and a disciple of Jesus Christ. And so when we are prioritizing being a conservative or being a liberal over that identity, I think that's when we can do harm to our own souls and do harm to our fellow man. If we really care about loving God and loving our fellow man, then it is our duty to make sure that is our first and foremost priority is loving God, loving our neighbor, not letting those political ideologies overcome who we truly are. But thank you guys, and God bless. This is a tough time, but we're going to get through it as long as we rely on Jesus Christ.